So today in our lesson, we're going to be talking about what happens when the war is over. Clearly, we cannot just end things and be done with it. We need to have peace treaties. We need to make some deals and try to prevent a further world war in the future. And so President Woodrow Wilson has some ideas about that, and we're going to learn about those today. Two of the things you're going to learn about is the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations. And the thing is, most Americans don't really support those things. And that is what I want you to be listening for when I'm reading to you. So, why don't Americans support the Treaty of Versailles or the League of Nations? Here we go. There's a picture of Woodrow Wilson at the top of the page, and it says, "On board the American naval ship George Washington were President Woodrow Wilson and his advisors. They were sailing to France in the late 1918 to help the Allies set the terms of peace following World War I. As the ship passed the Statue of Liberty, a hopeful Wilson waved his hat to the crowd. At last he would have a chance to keep his promise of making the world safe for democracy." Wilson's 14 points. Woodrow Wilson was the first American president to meet international leaders on foreign soil. He was determined to do whatever was needed to achieve his vision of a just and lasting peace. In the end, however, Wilson failed. The other Allied leaders, it turned out, did not share his vision or his hopes. Even the American people were in disagreement about how to approach the post-war world. In Europe, Wilson visited Paris, London, Milan, and Rome. Everywhere, cheering crowds welcomed him. He thought that the crowd shared his goal of peace without victory. In fact, he was wrong. The Europeans who greeted Wilson so warmly scoffed at his high-minded proposals for peace. They and their leaders were determined to punish the Germans for the war. In January 1918, even before the war ended, Wilson outlined his peace plan. Known as the 14 Points, it was meant to prevent international problems from causing another war. The first point in Wilson's plan called for an end to secret agreements. Secrecy, Wilson felt, had encouraged the web of rival alliances that had helped lead to war. Next, he called for freedom of the seas, free trade, and a limit on arms. He urged peaceful settlements of disputes over colonies. He also supported the principle of national self-determination, that is, the right of national groups to have their own territory and forms of government. For Wilson, however, the 14th point was the most important. It called for a General Association of Nations, or League of Nations. Its job would be to protect the independence of all countries, large or small. His goals were clear. And this is from a speech he made in January 8th of 1918. "An evident principle runs through the whole program that I have outlined. It is the principle of justice to all peoples and nationalities, and their right to live on equal terms of liberty and safety with one another, whether weak or strong." If you look at the bottom of the page, it gives you a few details from Wilson's 14 points. The first one says, "All treaties between nations should be made public in order to avoid secret treaties such as the Triple Alliance." If you remember in the play we did, everybody was making treaties with each other, and it just became a big disaster. So I can understand why he would want them to do that. The next one says, "All countries should be able to freely navigate the oceans and seas in times of peace." Next, strengthening trade between countries will help create a lasting peace. Nations should only keep enough weapons to be able to defend themselves against the possibility of attack. An international organization of nations will help prevent the possibility of another world war. And finally, colonial claims must be settled with the involvement of local populations. On the next page, we see a picture of the Big Four. These are some of the most important Allied leaders. So we have George Orlando, we have Clemenceau, and then we have Wilson. So those are the four big ones. And they met in Paris to negotiate that peace treaty. So we'll start underneath that picture. It says, "Wilson persuaded the Allies to accept the 14 points as the basis for making peace. However, the plan soon ran into trouble. Some goals were too vague. Others conflicted with reality. In Paris, Wilson faced a constant battle to save his 14 points. He discovered that the Allies were more concerned with protecting their own interests than with forging a lasting peace." The Paris Peace Conference. Diplomats from more than 30 nations met in Paris and Versailles to negotiate 5 separate peace treaties known as the Peace of Paris. Key issues were decided by the leaders of the Allied nations known as the Big Four: Woodrow Wilson of the United States, David Lloyd David Lloyd George of Britain, George Clemenceau of France, and Vittorio Orlando of Italy. Again, those are the four men in the picture. Allied nations disagree. Each leader had his own aims. Wilson had called for peace without victory. He opposed punishing the defeated powers. The other allies, however, ached for revenge. Germany must pay, they said. They insisted on large reparations or cash payments for the losses they had suffered during the war. Further, they wanted to include a war guilt clause that would force Germany to accept responsibility for the war. The Allies were also determined to prevent Germany from rebuilding its military strength. In particular, Clemenceau wanted to weaken Germany so that it could never again threaten France. "Mr. Wilson bores me with his 14 points," he complained. "Why, God Almighty only has 10." The haggling continued for months. In the end, Wilson had to compromise on his 14 points in order to save his key goals, especially the League of Nations. However, he would not budge on the League. With the League in place, he believed any mistakes made in Paris could be later corrected. Humiliation for Germany. By June 1919, the Treaty of Versailles, the most important treaty of the Peace of Paris, was ready. None of the Allies were satisfied with it. Germany, which had not even been allowed to send delegates to the peace talks, was shocked by the terms of the treaty. Still, its representatives had no choice but to sign. Under the treaty, Germany had to take the blame for the war. The treaty stated the following: "The Allied and associated governments affirm, and Germany accepts, the responsibility of Germany and her allies for causing all the loss and damage to which the Allied and associated governments and their nationals have been subjected as a consequence of the war imposed on them by the aggression of Germany and her allies." Germany also had to pay the Allies huge reparations, including the cost of pensions for Allied soldiers of their widows and children. The total cost of German reparations would come to over $300 billion. Other provisions of the Treaty of Versailles were aimed at weakening Germany. The treaty severely limited the size of the German military. It returned Alsace-Lorraine to France. In addition, the treaty stripped Germany of its overseas colonies, which were put under the control of Britain or France. The Germans, wrote one reporter, suffered a horrible humiliation. Britain and France were also given mandates or authorization by the League of Nations to govern territory in what was the Ottoman Empire. The purpose of the mandates was to govern these territories until they could function as independent nations. The British would control the former Turkish provinces of Iraq and Palestine, while the French would control Syria and Lebanon. Wilson keeps his League of Nations. Despite opposition to many of the 14 points, Wilson succeeded in keeping some of them. In Eastern Europe, the Allies provided for several new nations to be formed on the principles of self-determination, including Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia. They were created of lands once ruled by Germany, Russia, and Austria-Hungary. In addition, Poland regained its independence as a nation. Some people were dissatisfied with the new boundaries. Many Germans, for example, had settled in Poland and Czechoslovakia, and before long Germany would seek to regain control of German-speaking peoples in Eastern Europe. To Wilson, however, his greatest achievement was persuading the Allies to include the League of Nations in the treaty. Wilson was certain that the League would prevent future wars by allowing nations to talk over their problems. If talk failed, members would join together to fight aggressors. "A living thing is born," he declared. "The League is definitely a guarantee of peace." Wilson fights for the Treaty of Versailles. When President Wilson returned home, he faced a new battle. He had to persuade the Senate to approve the Versailles Treaty and to approve American participation in the League of Nations. American opposition. Most Americans favored the treaty. A vocal minority opposed it, however. Some said that it was too soft on the defeated powers. Many German Americans felt that it was too harsh. Some Republicans hoped to embarrass President Wilson, a Democrat, by rewriting or defeating the treaty. Isolationists, people who wanted the United States to stay out of world affairs, opposed the League of Nations. They were convinced that the League would lead to an entangling alliance. Other people who were against the League felt that it did not have enough authority to solve any pressing economic problems. They thought that it could lead to another war. Critics of the treaty found a leader in Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts. Lodge, a Republican, was chairman of the powerful Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Lodge accepted the idea of the League of Nations. However, he wanted changes in some provisions relating to the League. He believed that Americans were being asked to subject our own will to the will of others. Specifically, Lodge objected to Article 10 of the treaty. It called for the League to protect any member whose independence or territory was threatened. Lodge argued that Article 10 could involve the United States in future European wars. He wanted changes in the treaty that would ensure that the United States remained independent of the League. He also wanted Congress to have the power to decide on a case-by-case basis whether the United States would follow League policy. Wilson believed that Lodge's changes would weaken the League. Advisers urged the president to compromise, to give up some of his demands in order to save the League. Wilson replied, "Let Lodge compromise." He refused to make any changes. The Senate rejects the treaty. As the battle grew hotter, the president took his case to the people. In early September 1919, Wilson set out across the country. He traveled nearly 8,000 miles and made 37 speeches in 29 cities. He urged Americans to let their senators know that they supported the treaty. There below is a picture of President Wilson. He's in the middle there, at a peace march in Washington, D.C. after he returned from Paris. And at the very end, we have Wilson kept up a relentless pace. On September 25th, the exhausted president complained of a headache. His doctors canceled the rest of the trip. Wilson returned to Washington, and a week later, his wife found him unconscious. He had suffered a stroke that had left him bedridden for weeks. In November 1919, the Senate rejected the Versailles Treaty. "It is dead," Wilson mourned, "and every morning I put flowers on its grave." Gone, too, was Wilson's cherished goal, American membership in the League of Nations. The United States did not sign a peace treaty with Germany until 1921. Many nations had already joined the League of Nations. Without the United States, though, the League failed to live up to its goal in protecting members against aggression. Wilson's dream of a world for democracy would have to wait. So your job is to, first of all, go back to page 689, read those details at the bottom of the page again, that table that I read to you, and choose one of those points that you think is most important to keep in order to maintain the peace, so to keep people from going back to war again. And then tell me why you chose it. So that would be complete sentences, kind of an answer. On the next slide, the League of Nations was a group that formed after World War I to protect the independence of countries. The Treaty of Versailles was the treaty signed by Germany and the Allies at the end of World War I. Americans did not support either. Why? So I told you at the beginning to be looking for those things. Why did not America support the Treaty of Versailles or the League of Nations? And you will, if you look back in the reading, there's going to be different groups that have different reasons for not liking it. So make sure you're looking back there for that. I might even give you a big fat hint if you're still listening. Bottom of page 692 is a great place to look. Make sure you do your very best and send me an email if you're having any trouble.